Sure, Paddy dear, and did you hear the news that's going round? This is our first live stream since the end of lockdown in Victoria. Does it feel like a relief?
It does, yeah. It
Still
does.
can't go out anywhere, but the point of the matter is that if we wanted to, we probably could. But instead, we're spending this Friday night with all of you lovely people at home, and it's going to be a good one tonight, I feel. So if you've read the description, if you knew about the event, then you will know that the topic of this broadcast is Joe Byrne. Joe Byrne, for those of you playing at home, was a member of the Kelly Gang. And to discuss Joe Byrne with me is our resident Joe Byrne expert, Georgina Stones.
Hello, everybody. Some of you may know me from all of my sharing and my researching about Joe.
And a lot of you will know Georgina from an Outlaw's Journal,
Yeah.
which she's been working on for quite some time. And in that time, she's uncovered quite a lot of stuff that has been left out of a lot of the history books. And she will be talking with us all about that tonight. If you do have any questions at any point during the broadcast, feel free to comment them. And in the second half, we will do our best to answer them as well as we can. And if you're watching this in the future, where this broadcast is already finished, you can still comment on the video, and we will do our best to reply to those comments when we can. So, to give us a bit of background information, Georgina is going to give us a brief overview of the life of Joe Byrne so that we've got some stuff to sort of build upon. So, would you care to take it away?
Yeah, so Joe was born in 1856 in Sebastopol in the Woolshed Valley near Beechworth. His parents were obviously Paddy and Margaret Byrne, and he had 6 siblings. So there was Joe was the oldest, followed by Kate, and then Paddy, and then Mary, and then Dennis, Margaret, and then baby Ellen. So obviously Joe, for those that don't know, Joe attended the Woolshed Catholic School, where he was joined we don't actually know when he was joined by Aaron there, but so Aaron also joined that school.
Aaron Sherritt, for
Aaron
those of you.
Sherritt, yeah. So Joe was always a really good student, always up there in the top of his class, and unfortunately, or devastatingly, I should say, in 1866, his father Paddy had his first heart attack. So Joe's grades really suffered because of that, obviously. And then in 1870, Joe lost his father again. Well, yeah, he lost his father to heart disease again. Sorry. And so Joe was forced to leave school. So he was about 13, 14 when that happened. So I mean, that's an extremely young age to lose your father, pulled out of schooling, and then be the man of the house. So Joe, he was, helping his mother Margaret, who was now a widow with a baby. He was helping her on their selection. He was chopping and selling wood, as his father had done as well, just to earn some money to, feed them and clothe them. He also got jobs with the local Chinese, helping them in their shops and in their different stores. He worked for a time for Dodd's Tannery in Beechworth, where he drove the tannery cart. So he'd go and pick up the hides and then take them to the tannery. He also, for a little bit, he was working picking up in the shearing shed up in the Upper Murray, I'm saying this, but we don't know the exact dates of when these jobs were taking place. They're just recorded as Joe doing them. And early on, so when Joe was in his teens, walking home one night while he was employed in Sebastopol, he witnessed the torture of Arsui outside a shop owned by Yi Fang when he was about 15, 16, which was really obviously traumatic for him. So that was probably the first time in Joe's life that he would have witnessed such a traumatic, well, apart from the death of his father. Yeah.
So that gives us a good sort of lead in. Now, it's a lot of information. It's very hard to condense, more than a decade of someone's life into a couple of minutes, but you managed, which is good. So the thing that sort of jumps out at me about Joe is that obviously we know he lost his father at an early age, and from that point onwards he was doing odd jobs to provide for the family. Why do you think it is that we have this image of Joe being sort of idle? That he didn't really like to work. He was work shy.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. Obviously, I really love Ian Jones and the work that he did, but one of the things that really annoys me is he pushes this thing of Joe not working, swaggering around Beechworth while his mother was home, and I don't think that adds up because we can't say, oh, this is when he was doing this job and this is when he was doing that job. Obviously, it is recorded, as I said, that he was picking up in a shearing shed. He was working for the tannery and in a store in the Chinese camp. So I don't know. I think the issue with Joe was that he was so loyal to Aaron that he spent a lot of his time working on Aaron's selection, long days, hard work, unpaid. And I think obviously that took him away from Margaret, and that took him away from helping her on the farm, milking the cows, bringing the bullocks in and all that kind of stuff. So I think she resented that, obviously. And that's where I believe Ian Jones got a lot of his kind of ideas that Joe was work shy from.
So it was more of a case that it wasn't that Joe was work shy, because he obviously worked quite a lot and he worked a lot of varied jobs, but that there was this handed down perception of him being disloyal to the family and not providing for them the way that he was expected to.
Yeah.
One of the things that often gets talked about but doesn't get a lot of coverage is Joe's relationship with the Chinese. We know later on that becomes important. We know that he developed an ability to speak the language of the Chinese miners, which it wasn't Mandarin, was it?
No, it was Cantonese. So, so the Chinese miners who was mixing with, they were from Canton. So, for instance, Yeon, Hangyang, Nam, Sui, Namxing, they were all from Canton.
So, I mean, for a lot of us, we don't have a lot of understanding of the geopolitical and geosocial stuff in China, unless you happen to be someone who does know a lot about China. So I think perhaps to some degree a little bit of that gets lost because we can't relate to it as easily.
Yeah.
But one thing that really interests me is the work that you've done in finding Joe's connection to the Arsui case, and how this is an event that really hasn't been mentioned before.
Well, I mean, it's mentioned in passing, like a sentence, Joe. Like I know Ian Jones, he uses it when he's describing that Joe was obviously labouring in 1872, but that's all. And this case, I think, in terms of Sebastopol and Beechworth and Victoria, was huge. I mean, this is a clear case of the triads who were, I suppose, the Chinese mafia in a way, weren't they?
Well, it's a little bit more complex.
Yeah,
but we don't know all the ins and outs of that.
No.
All you and I have been able to uncover is that the triad in China at the time would usually sponsor people to go to other countries and build up their businesses, but unfortunately, a lot of them would fall into debt, and then as a result of that, they'd fall afoul of their sponsors. And that's where I think Arsui ended up, isn't it?
Yeah, so Arsui worked, or he didn't work for these, he had debts with these two men, Yeon and Hangyang. And they were it was like a measly. I can't remember the amount, but it was really measly. Um, and so what they did is they ordered one of their friends, one of their mates, to go and collect him from Bright, to force him onto a cart, and then they brought him back to Sebastopol. They chained him up to the front of Yi Fang's store. They kicked him, they punched him, they tortured him for hours and hours, demanding money, demanding money. They stripped him of clothes. They stripped him of his clothing. So when Joe saw him on Wednesday night, in his evidence, he says that he had nothing on, and he goes so far as to say that if he did indeed have trousers on, they were very short. So basically, they removed all his clothing. So also when Joe saw him as well, one of the men were like hitting the clothing, to try and get this money out. And as Asui said, I have no money. I am broke. There's nothing that you can get from me. And the really sad thing is, so one of the men who was also there when Asui was being tortured was his own uncle. Now he was also a member, I believe, of the triads as well. And even though he owned Yeon and Hangyang twice as much, he was left alone. So I think that's really telling that what we're seeing is this group of, kind of underworld Chinese dealings.
And I mean, obviously there is a little bit of difficulty in trying to unravel some of that because it's not something that's on the public record as much as some other things.
No.
And it was kept very secret at the time. A lot of the press didn't seem to really know anything about it.
No, and something that I really find baffling is the jury were never paid. I found a lot of information in the Ovens and Murray about people that had sat on the jury complaining that they were never paid. I think that's really strange.
And there was a sort of leniency towards Yeon and Han Young, wasn't there?
Yeah, so Redmond Barry was the judge. Now, just to put it in some context, Ellen Kelly got 3 years hard labour for her involvement in the Fitzpatrick affair. Yeon and Han Young, they tortured a man to death, and they got 3 years, and in fact they were let off early. I mean, I think that is telling, and I'm not talking about, torture that happened in the afternoon. We know from Joe, he saw it twice, I believe on Tuesday, and then again on Wednesday. We have other people who were Sebastopol residents who saw it in 3 days happening. I mean, there was one of our Sui's friends, when they had finally done with the torture, he would untie him and take him back to his hut, and it would only be like half an hour later, and they'd be going back to retie him.
So this sort of sets a bit of the tone for the kind of things that you would be experiencing if you went to the Chinese camp at Sebastopol at that time.
Yeah.
It was a very rowdy place, wasn't it?
It was very rough. I mean, yes, the Chinese were very industrious and they worked hard, but at the same time, they were very severe. I mean, there's stories. There's one market gardener who, around Joe's time, who was found staked to his garden around the neck, so the chain around his neck, and then staked to the ground. And someone came to save him, and he said, "Oh no, I can't. Like, he was too frightened that if the men that had put him there saw him unchained, what would happen,
So this wasn't the only time that Joe was kind of exposed to a bit of that rougher side of the Chinese community in Sebastopol, was it?
No, so in 18, so the year following, so the year after he saw Asui being tortured, he was walking home from Beechworth to Sebastopol with one of his miner friends named Arnhem, and they got close to Sebastopol, and along the Woolshed Road there was a cart stopped beside the road, and there was a man and 3 girls and 1 boy. And as they passed, Joe asked, if they needed any help. And it's alleged by everyone except Joe, which I think, kind of speaks to a bit of the racism that Arnhem felt. But he apparently frightened the 2 girls. And so that is what caused the man whose name was Robert Woods to confront Arnhem about it. And then there was a brawl. Arnhem had a bit of iron that he kind of cut Arnhem with across the head. You had Arnhem with a sapling flogging it, around the head of Robert Woods. It was really violent. And so Joe had to shield the 2 girls as well as the young boy. There was blood, Arnhem was bleeding profusely from the eye. I don't know how he didn't, how he wasn't blind. But eventually, somehow, it broke up, or, onlookers were able to break the 2 apart. But just interestingly, one of the girls, her name is Ellen Salisbury, and she became one of the vital kind of people in Joe's life. Not only did they go on to, form an attachment like, sweethearts, but also she served him as like a really, strong sympathiser. So for me, like, if that is the first documented case of Ellen Salisbury and Joe meeting, I think that's really important in the story of Joe.
So in a sense, it's like that act of kindness that Joe displayed to her all the way back then was enough for her to give him unconditional support later on when he became an outlaw.
Yeah.
So as we sort of emerge from this period where Joe's been working with the Chinese and doing all his best to try and bring in some money for the family, that's when he starts to sort of take off with Aaron a lot more, isn't it?
Yeah, so in probably like in the middle of the 70s, so 1875 is when things start to go a bit downhill for Joe. Obviously, he's spending all of his days working on Aaron's selection, so together they built a slab hut, they fenced it, made their horse paddocks. And obviously Joe, he had that influence of Aaron, and Aaron was very cheeky and prone to just being a really silly young larrikin. And obviously Joe was, just very loyal, and so he stuck by Aaron. So, there was a lot of, that's when, this Joe started to become more not so kind of reserved and quiet, I suppose.
It's like Aaron's larger personality brought Joe out of his shell a bit more.
Yeah.
So it's about this time, Aaron at that point was involved with a few individuals who were not necessarily operating within the confines of the law, was he?
No, so around this time, Aaron broke in a cult for someone called John Phelan. This was John, wasn't it? Yeah. There's so many names, sorry. Yeah, so he broke in a cult for John Phelan. So John Phelan was the local pound keeper. And so he thought, well, I'm in a good job, but how can I make it better? So what he'd do, him and Aaron would, there'd be a horse proclaimed lost. They would find that horse, and then they would keep it to get the reward. So then they would bring it in, or they were changing brands. So they were stealing horses, changing the brands, and then they'd be sold as theirs. Now, Joe didn't like John. That's evidence in the outlawry period, and also before an incident that I've always found quite funny is when Joe was riding down in the wool shed, he came across a saddle, and he thought, well, my lucky day. So he took the saddle home with him. And then it just happened to be that a couple of months later, him and Aaron rode up to John Phelan's, and John Phelan's like, oh, he didn't tell Joe. He didn't mention that Joe was riding in his saddle at the time. But after, when they'd left, he went down to the police and reported Joe as having stolen the bit of tack. So Joe was found drinking at the Shamrock Hotel in Beechworth. And Joe's defence was, well, I found it, so it's mine. So he was trying to kind of claim that, the rule of finders keepers is real.
Well, some people would see it that way. Entire countries have been founded that way, haven't they?
Yeah.
But Joe himself wasn't necessarily involved in criminal activities at that time, was he?
No.
So when was it that Joe sort of first ran afoul of the law?
1876. So there's two incidents that both involve cows. The first incident is in February 1876. Aaron and Joe bring in an unbranded roan-coloured calf to be butchered by the Sherritt family butcher. And Aaron's instructions are he wants to hide back to make whips. Now, this is an unbranded calf, so we don't know, if it was John or Aaron's, John Sherritt being Aaron's father, or if Joe and Aaron, if they found it, we don't know. So they never got in trouble for that incident, but when Mullane found that the butcher had allowed Aaron to take back the unbranded hide, he was not a happy man. And I do believe the butcher was fined for that because they were meant to keep the hides for a certain period of time. So, just in case, such things as, unbranded hides, so the police could say, well, that's not right, And also around that time, they were branding fillies in the Byrnes, one of the Byrne neighbours' stockyards by the name of Ned Kennedy. So they would take these foals and then they would brand them in his stockyards, and then they would obviously they would break them in. Obviously Aaron had that ability, so they would break them in and then they would obviously resell them on. And then obviously later in June or in late May, we have where Aaron and Joe are, they're going past the Eldorado school and they notice a cow there. And Aaron thinks, well, we should take that. So they did, and they also butchered that in Ned Kennedy's stockyard. But unfortunately, on this occasion, Sandy Doig, a neighbour, who was like just a nosy busybody, he had heard the cow bellow after it had its throat cut. So he went to investigate, and he found Joe and Aaron with the carcass, and unfortunately he saw the brand, so he was able to hurry back down and let Ward know what had happened.
So for those who aren't aware, who was Mullane?
So Mullane, he was a constable, very hated by Joe. He'd started off like Detective Ward as a
he was a stock inspector, wasn't
he? Yeah. So he'd started off doing that, and then he'd risen through the ranks. So the two policemen to really play an vital role, in leading role in Joe's life were Senior Constable Patrick Mullane and obviously the Detective Michael Ward. And Joe hated both men with a passion. I mean, he wrote to Ward saying that if he could shoot Ward, he would swing easy, and he'd love to put Ward's body in a log and burn it. And with Mullane, he told Aaron that he'd love to make a target of him. So these were not men that Joe respected.
That's one way of putting it, yes.
Yeah.
So the incident with the El Dorado school cow, what happened? Did Joe end up in jail? Did he end up getting off? What happened?
So, because of that incident, Joe and Aaron, they were sentenced to 6 months hard labour in Beechworth Jail. But actually, it was more than that because after they were, when they were being sentenced, so when they'd first been arrested, they couldn't afford the bail money. So they were remanded for a period, I think it was 8 days. So they would have, been in jail then as well. I mean, jail for them both would have just been horrendous. I mean, I know Ian talks about once they had their prison clothing, they could see the sentence with, serve the sentence with bravado. But I honestly don't believe that because it's a horrendous place.
Yeah, well, I mean, prison at that time was designed to take the bravado out of people. Now, one of the big problems with Victorian prisons is that they believed that punishing people was a way of stopping them from reoffending. So it wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about persuading them not to break the law. But it was still a marked improvement on what we'd seen in the decades previous, where something like stealing a cow and slaughtering it would have seen them both hanged.
Yeah. I mean, because they already had, kind of.
Well, they didn't have prior convictions,
No,
but they were known to the authorities.
Yeah, so I think that made it worse as well.
So it was kind of like, this was the one time where they weren't going to get off.
No.
That, there wasn't any way to wriggle out of it. So after they got out of jail, what kind of situation did they find themselves in?
So, you'd hope that kind of they learn a lesson, but they didn't. So we don't really hear much about how they live. I do know that around that time, Joe was living in the hut that they'd built. So at that time, Aaron was living with his family at Sheep Station Creek, but Joe was living in the hut that they'd made on Aaron's selection, possibly with Bessie, Aaron's sister, who Joe was his girlfriend at the time. Yeah. And then obviously, unfortunately, trouble is at the door again because when they're bathing in the wool shed, I don't know why, it was a hot day and they decided that they'd, strip off and go for a swim. But unfortunately, the place that they chose to swim was also where the Chinese got the water for the vegetables. So when a man called On saw them naked and bathing in the dam where they got their water from, he's thinking, well, can you get out, please? And then words were kind of exchanged, and then On went back to get a few of his mates who were all armed with bamboos, and so they chased Joe. They were chasing Aaron, and they were, slashing at him with the bamboos. So obviously, in retaliation, Aaron grabbed a rock, he threw it, he hit On, and he fell bleeding from the head. And then it wasn't long after that Aaron was arrested, and then a couple of days later, Joe was also arrested and put back in a courthouse.
The injury that On received as a result of being hit by the rock was quite severe, wasn't it?
It was, yeah.
So the report stated that it was the occipital bone, which had been broken, which is this part here. And from memory, you'll be able to jog my memory if I get it wrong. The bit where the bone was broken was so badly fractured that they actually had to remove all of the bone.
I believe so, yeah.
So he had a sort of a dip in his cheek thereafter. And that went to court, as you would expect. Did they go to jail for that?
No, but they were remanded because they couldn't afford the bail. So, Yeah, but I think Joe especially would have been really angry at Aaron. I mean, you know, when on that fateful night of June 26th, he says to Aaron, over Aaron's body, the bastard will never put me away again. Yeah.
So there seems to have been this relationship where Aaron was definitely leading a lot of the time. Joe was following unquestionably. Um, do you think that perhaps there was almost like a symbiotic relationship there where Joe needed Aaron to guide him into things, that Aaron also needed the validation of a follower in order to sort of build up his own ego?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think Joe, he was very much, he had that personality that he needed someone to guide him. I mean, we see that later on with Ned as well, and yeah, and obviously that got him in a lot of trouble. And then obviously it did lead to his death as well.
Hmm. So we're in 1876, 77. Joe's found himself in and out of jail. But he hasn't really learned his lesson about not breaking the law, has he?
No.
He starts falling in with certain someone about this time, does he not?
Yeah, so around this time, so interestingly, there was a young teenager, or how old would Dan have been?
16.
Yeah, so 16-year-old Dan was also in the lockup when Aaron and Joe were there waiting for their trial. So it's Aidan and I's belief that it was possibly through Dan that Joe met Ned, because I mean we have a recorded meeting of Joe Byrne and Daniel Kelly. So obviously we can't say for certain, but I think there is something there to suggest that from Joe's becoming closer with Dan, then Dan kind of introduces him to Ned.
So, I mean, this is where we have a lot of issues with regards to how did the Kellys and Byrne cross paths. There's nothing specific that's recorded to say where or when.
No.
We know that Ian Jones for a long time was of the opinion that they met Ned just after they got out of jail and started working at the timber mill with him. But there's not really anything to back that up other than just a guess. And that's kind of the thing, is that, even at the time, no one really knew how they knew each other, because where the Kellys and the Harts were based in Greta and in Wangaratta was quite a distance away from Beechworth, where Joe and Aaron were usually hanging around.
Yeah, and it's that, and they led such different lives, really, yeah.
So, but what we do know for a fact, reasonably as a fact, and this is where we start to see a little bit of the assumptions take over from what's recorded, is that Joe and Aaron worked with Ned, stealing horses and selling them over the border.
Yeah, so at this time, Joe adopted an alias, Billy King. Obviously, Aaron may have had one as well, but we don't know what his was. And yeah, he just, yeah.
So where we get sort of conflicting information is that a lot of the people who interacted with them at this time, they didn't know who Ned was, they didn't know who Joe was, they weren't famous or infamous, really. And in fact, if I recall correctly, the initial descriptions of who we now refer to as Billy King, it said a man named George King. They'd gotten him mixed up with Ned's stepfather.
Yeah.
So that in itself creates a kind of complexity. Did he adopt that surname for his alias in order to create that confusion?
Yeah.
But what we can say is that when Ned was recounting that period, he only referred to himself and George King. And when Aaron Sherritt was telling Superintendent Hare about it, he stated that the only people who were involved were himself, Ned, and Joe. So there's a very good indication that Joe was probably involved at the very least in some capacity.
Yeah.
But this was the first time he'd been involved in something that was such a high-scale crime. Why do you think he went in for that?
Again, I think, there's someone to follow. It's a bit of excitement. Joe was only young. For Joe, there was more to life than being stuck at Sebastopol. I mean, his character attests to that. His way of life attests to that. I think, yeah, it was fun. It was exciting. Making easy money, I suppose, as well. The more important thing. Yeah.
So it wasn't too long before things really went downhill, was it? Because that period where what Ian Jones refers to as the witty larceny, and I think a lot of other authors have since used that descriptor, that kind of overlaps a bit with the Fitzpatrick affair. So it would be reasonable to suggest that Joe and Aaron were still sort of fraternising with Ned at that point, right up to the moment that Ned was involved in the Fitzpatrick incident.
Yeah.
Now we do know that some people have said, and this is based on the testimony of Bricky Williamson, who was a neighbour to the Kellys, that it was Joe who was at the Kelly house and not Bill Skillion. And Ian Jones kind of ran with this, and a lot of other people have run with it too. We do bring up Ian Jones quite a bit because he's the only person to date that has actually written a book that substantially looks at the lives of Joe Byrne and Aaron Sherritt. So a lot of his research has kind of defined how most people see these two individuals. But at any rate, he's very much of the opinion that it must have been Joe, mistaken for Bill Skillion. But there's a big problem with that, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, for someone to mistake them, they would have to be blind, because Bill and Joe, they look completely different. There's no way that the two could have been mistaken for each other. It's just really silly.
Well, I mean, one of the things that immediately jumps out at me is that Joe was a few inches taller than Bill Skillion. He was not as heavy as Bill Skillion, and he wasn't as old as Bill Skillion.
No.
And if Fitzpatrick had been spending time around the Kelly property, he would know what Bill Skillion looked like, because they were basically neighbours of the Kellys.
Yeah.
So the idea that Joe Byrne was present doesn't hold a lot of weight once you start to get through some of the obvious things. Then obviously the fact that it seemed that Bill Williamson had some kind of thing about Joe. He didn't like Joe very much.
No, so his view of Joe is very harsh. So he went straight to the police, and he was telling them about Joe's when he was in jail. Sorry, I believe. Yeah. And he said that Joe was dangerous, and he would be the first to fire upon anyone. So already it's like, well, why is he saying this? Who's he trying to protect? You know what I mean? Like, who's he trying to? Well, yeah.
And it doesn't take a genius to realise the person he's trying to protect is himself.
Yeah.
Because, of course, he only came up with this information after he'd already been thrown in jail.
Yeah.
So it's very, very likely that it was all an attempt to sort of deflect a bit and sort of say, well, if it wasn't Bill Skillion, then Fitzpatrick's evidence isn't really accurate, so you can't trust it, and blah, blah. So in a way, it's almost the same as what Ned was doing by saying, I wasn't even there, I was 300 miles away, I was 500 miles away.
Yeah.
But at any rate, because of what happened on the 15th of April, 1878, in Greta, Ned Kelly and Dan Kelly went into the bush, they went to the Wombat Ranges, and of course, Joe being Joe, he followed.
So Joe helped the brothers. He was with them in making whiskey, obviously to make money for Ellen's trial. And again, he's work shy, but there he is working incredibly hard, unpaid.
Although I suppose,
well,
yeah,
he got his fair share out of it.
One of the things that is really important to know about Joe is that he was a man who loved indulging his vices, particularly alcohol. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence, which is pretty much all we've got to go on for most things, but he liked to drink, he liked women, he liked smoking, he liked smoking opium. All these things that they were what he sort of lived for. He was what would be referred to as a hedonist, which is quite different in a lot of ways to what the other boys were like.
Yeah.
He did have his love of horses, of course, like the others did, but his tastes were a little bit more carnal than what the others were sort of more prone to.
Yeah.
So it's not difficult to imagine Joe putting his hand up when Ned says, "I'm going to start distilling whiskey."
Yeah.
Of course, given that it's in an illegal still in the bush, it probably isn't proper whiskey, is it?
No, so it would have been clear. So I can't pronounce it, but it was.
Poitin.
Yeah. So it would have been like moonshine. I mean, it would have probably blown their heads off. It would have been so strong, and yeah, it would have been clear because obviously my understanding is that the colour comes from the barrels, from the aging. Yeah.
Yeah, except for the modern drinks, which are usually given caramel and stuff to colour them. But at any rate, he may have had good intentions of helping his mates out, but it's led him into a very, very precarious situation. And in fact, a situation that he really shouldn't have been in the first place, should he?
No.
So, I mean, it's probably no surprise to anyone that the next big event was at Stringy Bark Creek. So, 15th of October, Ellen Kelly, Bill Skillian and Bill Williamson are sentenced. And then a party is sent out from Mansfield consisting of Sergeant Kennedy, Constables Lonergan, Scanlon and McIntyre. And they camp very close to the Kellys' hideout. So Ned has this bright idea. We're going to go down, we're going to take all their guns, their ammunition, their horses, their food, and send them back. And for some reason he thinks that they will provide no resistance if he does this. And so Joe's there, Dan's there, and Dan's mate Steve Hart is also there. And they all decide to go down together. Now, we don't have anyone's account of this other than McIntyre's and Ned Kelly's.
Yeah.
So we don't really know what Joe's motivation was, do we?
No.
Is there any indication that you've come across about how Joe may have felt about what happened there at Stringy Bark?
Well, I think he would have been scared. That's what you're like. I mean, they all would have been scared. I mean, it was such a horrendous thing to find themselves in. They were there, Joe was there to help his mates. He wasn't there to kill police. That would have been the furthest thing from his mind of what would have happened.
Now, we did have the most recent Stringy Bark film that came out. And in that, Joe is portrayed as basically a psychotic madman. And it really couldn't be further from even McIntyre's description of Joe at that event.
No, I mean, McIntyre, he documents Joe making tea, giving him tea, telling him to fill his pipe and have a smoke. Like, it's not a nasty, callous, awful thing to do. He was just trying to be friendly to a man that was just as terrified as he was.
And of course, McIntyre retrospectively suggests that there were more sinister reasons behind his actions. He noted that Joe poured the tea from the billy, but he always waited for McIntyre to drink first before he had a drink.
Which is common sense. I mean,
But there's this sense that McIntyre portrays in his evidence that Joe wasn't coming across to him as being dangerous. In fact, he was the only one that appeared to be treating McIntyre with kindness. And it's only retrospectively that McIntyre was of the opinion that Joe was the most dangerous man there apart from Ned. And that may have had a lot to do with the fact that when all the chaos erupted upon Kennedy and Scanlon coming back to the camp, when McIntyre escaped, Joe was the one that chased after him, firing. Again, Joe was in the heat of the moment. He was following, the lead of his mates. He knew as well as any of the other three that if McIntyre got back to Mansfield, that his days were numbered.
Well, that's right. I mean, in such a violent and awful situation like that, you're only thinking of yourself because you haven't got time to be thinking of your actions. There's no time, you know.
And it's a little bit like when you're in kind of a war scenario. I mean, if you listen to some of the accounts of soldiers who were in the trenches during the First World War, they talk about how when combat initiates, you're kind of running on instinct. You're not conscious of what you're doing anymore. You're just sort of acting. You don't think, you feel, you just respond. And when we will go through the evidence, we can only sort of estimate what actually happened based on those two accounts that we've got, as well as the forensic evidence. But if we go with the sort of accepted mode that when Ned emerged in the camp, he shot Lonergan almost straight away, there would have been no time for anyone to respond. So chaos has already erupted, and Joe's got no option but to just run with it. What was he going to do? Is he going to turn on his mates, or is he going to, run away? What's he going to do? And one detail that's always come across as very interesting to me is that they all had rifles, but Joe's was a very old-fashioned rifle. What do you suppose it is that indicates about Joe? That he's got this old rifle with him, whereas the others have got these.
Yeah, well, we know that Joe wasn't out. He was with Aaron. The gun that he had most probably had been his father's. He wouldn't have had. I mean, there's no really interest there in the early part to show that he would have had a different gun.
Well, I mean, one thing that, as I've read up about the lifestyle of that era, is that a very popular activity was kangaroo hunting. Everyone did it. Dan Kelly was apparently very good at it. So they all would have had their own firearms, but they also would have had firearms on the farms to get rid of vermin. And, to suggest that there was kind of a gun culture or something like that they had violent tendencies because they had guns, is kind of a little bit, I think, ignorant of the reality of farm life back then and the nature of recreation. Because, to them, that was just a tool. It was like having an axe or a shovel.
Well, they needed it. I mean, if you had a horse that had broken its leg, what are you going to do? Leave it? So that's why, as I say, the gun that Joe had, probably would have been his father's. The farm gun that they used,
So, we're not talking about someone who has the best firearm because he's a keen marksman or anything. He's just got whatever he could get. So now, obviously, one of the things that we come to next is, where did they go after the killings? And one of the first things that they did was they visited Aaron Sheriff.
Yeah.
So can you describe what they did when they visited the sheriff property and why that sort of caused a problem?
You mean when Joe fired the gun? So when they got within range of the sheriff selection, Joe, obviously to alert Aaron, fired his gun into the air, and then Aaron guided them up to their hideout, which they would have used when they had the stolen horses when Joe was Billy King.
Yeah. So the thing that struck me about that was their act, the gang's act of getting up on that crest and firing their guns into the air until Aaron came out, was the thing that connected Joe Byrne to the gang. Prior to that, no one had any idea. The description of Joe didn't match anyone specific that the police were looking for. And so it wasn't until the police were sort of zooming around Sebastopol trying to find out what happened at the Sherrans that they made that connection between Aaron and Joe Byrne.
Yeah.
So in a way, it was a very silly thing to do.
Yeah, I question why he did it in the first place. I mean, yeah, I don't know why he'd want to draw attention to yourself in that way.
Perhaps they thought they were safe or something. Who knows?
He had gotten a bottle of brandy that morning, so.
Well, knowing Joe's proclivities, he probably didn't have much of that bottle of brandy left by the afternoon.
No.
So they kind of disappear for a little while as they're trying to keep a couple of steps ahead of the police all the time. And the next time they emerge is in December of that same year. And they make their appearance at Young Husband Station, Faithful's Creek. And this is where we see a different side of Joe than what we've seen before. It's almost that capability coming through, isn't it?
Yeah, so obviously we see Joe, he writes the Cameron letter, but also what I find really intriguing is he spends all his time in the kitchen with Mrs.
I was going to say McCormick, but it wasn't McCormick.
It starts with F.
Fitzgerald.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. This is the problem when you've got to remember so many facts. Little names tend to escape you.
Yeah, so when Joe was at Young Husbands, he spent all his time, or nearly all his time, in the kitchen with Mrs. Fitzgerald while she was cooking. So, to amuse her, he was playing tunes on the concertina. He was reading and commenting on things that he was reading to her. And she pointed out later that he seemed to be much more at ease around her than he was around the other men, which I find very telling of Joe, because he wasn't a loudmouth, really confident in himself. He was just happy to sit and chat to a woman, that was who he was.
Now, one thing that's always sort of jumped out at me is that Ned clearly had a strong belief in Joe's capabilities, because while all the rest of the gang went into your old to rob the bank, Joe was left at the station to guard everyone and to do whatever that was necessary in order to keep them in line.
Yeah.
Just one guy, and he was in charge of a whole bunch of people. In the storeroom, there's people plotting to break the walls down and hack him to death with an axe. He was not in a position to be able to really defend himself if anything got out of control.
No.
And yet he managed. And he stayed cool in his demeanour that whole time. So unlike the Heath Ledger film, where it portrays Joe attending the bank robbery, and then the Mick Jagger film does as well, Joe was never at Uriah during the bank robbery. He was back at Young Husband Station, guarding all of the people there.
Just an interesting detail that I love as well is when Watt came, so when they saw that, when he found out that all of the telegraph lines had been destroyed and he was inspecting them, Joe had to go and bail him up, obviously, because he didn't want him going back and saying, oh, there's something happening. Watt comments that when Joe was trying to put the key in the lock to open up the storeroom to put him in, he was so nervous that he couldn't actually fit it into the lock, which I find interesting. And it's like a human element. I know when I posted that incident on my page, I had comments about, that Joe wouldn't have been nervous, but yeah, he was. He would have been. He was a human being. They weren't born like that. I mean, there's incidents, of Joe being nervous and showing in like a nervous disposition all through his life,
And I think one of the things that is true of all of this is that, there's this assumption that the Kelly gang were just completely cool under pressure all the time, and that they never felt anything like fear. But really, I mean, humanity is prone to being afraid of things. But the key to being composed is being afraid but not showing it. You know, if you're walking around holding a gun, telling people to do what you want them to do, anything can happen.
Yeah.
And Joe knows firsthand what can happen in that situation. He doesn't want to spill more blood.
No.
He doesn't want to be labelled, the murderous Joe Byrne. But that's a potentiality that could happen if things got out of hand. So here he is on his own, guarding all these people, bailing someone up on his own. That is going to be nerve-wracking, regardless of how well you conceal it to everyone. But Joe managed to outfit himself elegantly enough, didn't he?
Yeah, so when he was, getting changed from the cart,
Lost his wagon, yeah.
Sorry, I apologise. My memory's really
That's
bad
all right.
this evening. Oh God. I will, like Joe, I'm prone to being nervous, so I apologise. Yeah. So what he got a Rob Roy shirt. So it's like a Braveheart shirt, isn't it?
It's more like something you'd see in like Outlander. The ladies know about Outlander, don't they?
Okay. Yeah.
So the big open collared shirt and the big puffy sleeves. Yeah. So we've got this little Byronic look to Joe at the moment. He's got the big puffy sleeve shirt and he's got the elegant black tie and everything. And Joe, being the most literate, is the one who has to write all of Ned's letters for him.
Yeah.
And so the Cameron letter was written by Joe. He had to get postage stamps.
Yeah, so he had to ask Mrs. Fitzgerald for a stamp, and then he weighed it in his hand, and he didn't think that one would carry it, so she had to go and get another one for him. And she commented to the police that he had beautiful writing.
Not bad for a man who left school at 14.
That's right, yeah.
So it's not long before they head to Geraldry, but in this intervening time, there's sort of talk about, do the gang have an arrangement with Aaron Sherritt for him to keep the police distracted while they're doing their outlaw business? So Aaron goes into the police station in Benalla. He says, I'd like to talk to Captain Standish, but Standish isn't in. He's away, and the person behind the desk is Superintendent Francis Augustus Hare, the South African, and he pretends that he's not really interested. He thinks he's being aloof, and Sherritt will just tell him all this information, and he won't have to do anything much about it. But Hare gets hooked, and this is kind of the first sign of what's to come.
Yeah.
Aaron spins this yarn about, they're going to Goulburn because there's relatives up there that they're going to see, and blah blah blah, and they're going to rob the bank. So with this information, the police go up to Goulburn. The Kellys cross way down the river at Geraldry. They don't cross at Geraldry, but they cross to go to Geraldry. And this is where we see a lot more of Joe's personality coming through, isn't it? This incident.
It is.
So while they're on the way to Geraldry, what does Joe get up to?
You mean with Mary?
At the Woolpack Inn, yeah.
So Dan and Steve stay in the bush where they've been camped, and Joe and Ned ride to the Woolpack Inn where Ned had been before. So he knows this barmaid, and he asks if she's still working there. So he says, "Oh, is Mary the larrikin still there?" And the barmaid says, "Oh, there's no one with that name." And then one of the publican's daughters tells Ned that the woman that he's just spoken to is in fact Mary. And so Joe, being Joe, he's absolutely taken and smitten by her. He just, she's brash. She's obviously, someone that they can talk to, and Joe being a lover of barmaids, he's just absolutely hooked. So the next night he comes back just to meet Mary, to spend time with Mary. So he's drinking and drinking and drinking. He's an outlaw with a price on his head. He's meant to be there to rob the bank. So he's there with Mary. And when he left after midnight, he was so drunk that two onlookers had to help him onto his horse because he obviously couldn't get his feet in the stirrup. So you can just imagine he's like hobbling around trying to get on his horse, and so two onlookers, they notice that he's got handcuffs, in his belt, so they think he's a policeman. So they think, well, rather than making fun of him, they better go and help him. I mean, what a position to be put in, And that was Joe. As soon as there was whiskey, as soon as there was, a barmaid there, he was gone.
So most of you will know the story of what happened in Georgina. They stuck up the police in the middle of the night. They took their uniforms and their guns, and they spent the next couple of days pretending to be policemen. And then the idea was to rob the bank. And at this time, Joe wasn't the one guarding all the prisoners. Joe was the one robbing the bank with Ned and Steve.
Yeah.
So in the hierarchy of the gang, I'd say that you had Ned obviously as the leader, and Steve I would say is the attack dog, because wherever Ned went, whether it's at Euroa or Drilldery, he always had Steve on hand to sort of menace whoever it was that they were sticking up. He was a little bloke, but he had this tendency to play up that aggression. So Joe comes in, and what's his demeanour like when robbing the bank?
Well, okay. Obviously, he was hungover to hell. He'd been drinking all night. He hadn't got in until after 12. So he poses, well, Ian Jones claims that he poses as a drunk, but I don't think it was much character.
Yeah, there wasn't much acting involved.
Ree, so when Joe took the horses to be shod, Ree, the farrier, said, that Joe's demeanour was very odd.
Yeah. So at that point, the pub and the bank were connected by a corridor. So Joe goes up the corridor through the back door of the bank and sticks everyone up. And I know that at one point they were trying to get the cash box open, and they didn't have the key. So what was Joe's suggestion? Get a big hammer and smash it.
Yeah, Joe wanted to just get a sledgehammer, and Ned was like, I don't know why Ned didn't agree to that, but anyway, the key was eventually found.
Yeah, well, I think perhaps Joe had sort of worked out that the problem with the Ural robbery was that Ned was going backwards and forwards looking for keys, and he just wanted to, well, literally smash and grab, which is a much more efficient way of robbing a bank, one would imagine. Now, there is one incident during the Gibraltar excursion which doesn't paint Joe in a very good light.
No, so when he's bailing up the kitchen staff, which included a Chinese man, no savvy, he says, I'm not, no. And Joe, understanding and knowing Cantonese, we don't know, but the Chinese cook may have muttered something under his breath that Joe didn't like, and he understood, and so Joe's got his gun and he's, hit him under the ear with it.
Yeah, so, he gave him a bit of a clip around the ear to remind him of his station and all of this. But then Joe, while everyone's in the pub being lectured to and stuff, Joe's out chopping down telegraph wires and things like that. So Joe had a very active role in Drilldery, far more than what most people remember, which is he wrote the Drilldery letter for Ned.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people go, oh, but Ned wrote the letter. Well, did he though? Because we've seen Ned's handwriting, we've seen Joe's handwriting, and we can make the connection between the handwriting in the Drilldery letter and Joe's.
Yeah.
So more than likely, Joe was dictated to by Ned. Joe wrote it, put in a few of his own little flourishes, and that's what became this iconic piece of Australian literature.
Yeah.
So, obviously Joe's going off some of the notes from the Cameron letter because some of it is lifted word for word.
Yeah.
But there are some obvious changes which make it a little bit more in-depth. But Joe wasn't really writing a lot of letters to his own family and friends at that time, comparatively. But he was writing to other people, wasn't he?
Yeah, so as I say with Ward, I mean, he was writing threatening letters to Ward, telling him that it's time for him to prepare for his latter end. He was writing to Jack Sherritt, Aaron's brother. I believe between his outlawry, Joe wrote between 60 and 70 letters to Jack. I mean, that's a huge amount. So yeah, he was, writing. He was, very active in letter writing, caricature drawing, mock reward poster drawing as well. So he'd make up these mock reward posters, for the apprehension of, Ward and Hare. And then, Jack would go and he would post them up on the post office tree in Beechworth. And I mean, it's such a cheeky thing to do, but it's also very clever.
And it's very much in keeping with that bushranger tradition. We had Matthew Brady offering mock reward posters, Michael Hare doing the same thing, as we've discussed, all the way through. Joe is almost, in a sense, like that classic bushranger, even more so than Ned, in some aspects, maybe not all. But it was after Geraldry that Joe really started to sort of separate from the gang a lot. He was seen around the woolshed on his own very often.
Yeah, so what some people might not realise is Joe, it's almost like he had his own sympathisers. So obviously, I've mentioned Ellen Salisbury. He had Chinese in the woolshed. He had men like James Chappell, James Batchelor, and Richard Murphy. They were all, on Joe's side, and he was interacting with them. He was writing letters and giving the letters to them to pass on to his mother. He was sleeping in Murphy's abandoned hut, in his haystack. So he was really, and he was also, as Aidan was saying, he was seen a lot around the woolshed and that on his own. So they weren't always together.
And I mean, obviously, on top of that, you've got Aaron Sherritt taking the police watch parties to watch the Byrne house, but he had them on a rise that was overlooking a part of the property where they wouldn't be able to see he was coming into the property from the other end.
No, so when Joe would go and visit Margaret and Paddy, he would kind of, like a bandicoot, kind of sneak through an old mining race. And obviously with Aaron and the police, and Aaron doing this on purpose, for those who think he was betraying Joe, had them on the other side, so they couldn't see anything. They couldn't, they didn't know, so Joe was coming in and out unseen.
So all the time that this is happening, there's all these rumours and innuendo going around that Aaron Sherritt's working with the police. We know that Jack Sherritt definitely was. According to all the police, Jack Sherritt was kind of not fully committal until he realised that he potentially could get the lion's share of the reward. Apparently that was what motivated him more than anything else, and that led him to the point where he was even throwing Aaron under the bus.
Yeah, I mean, a week before Aaron's death, or Aaron's murder, he wrote to Hare saying that he knew how to get the gang. He had these plans, he's the one who told Hare that, Joe was sleeping in a Sebastopol farmer's haystack. I mean, he told Hare that Aaron had the police party watching the wrong side of the house. If Aaron wanted to betray Joe, he would have done it in the first week.
Yeah.
It's idiotic to suggest that he strung it out that long. If you want the money that bad, why would you wait? And why would you place the police on the wrong side of the house? And, obviously we know also that during this time, Joe and Aaron, they're still in communication, they're still seeing each other. I mean, in December, both Joe and Aaron went to Yifang's store in Sebastopol, where they got a bottle of gin, some tobacco, and some opium. There's plenty of opportunities for Aaron to have, Joe taken.
The thing that really gets me about the idea of Aaron being the rat or the traitor or whatever label people want to slap on him, the money that he made from stringing the police along was far less than he would have made had he turned the gang in and gotten the reward money. But the thing that really jumps out at me about Aaron is that he had a verbal agreement with the Chief Commissioner of Police that if he could convince Joe to turn the other 3 members of the gang in, Joe wouldn't be hanged.
Yeah.
So all the way through, that was Aaron's thinking. He didn't really care that much about Ned and Dan and Steve. They were almost expendable. Like, they were still his mates, but they weren't Joe. Joe and Aaron were like brothers.
Yeah.
And so he was going to do everything he could if it had a chance of keeping Joe's neck out of a noose. But Joe didn't know that.
No.
Or at the very least, he didn't believe it. Because those rumours obviously got to him in the end. And it didn't help that the police weren't concealing that they were stationed in his hut and things like that. So, after months and months on the run, having to endure all the hardships of being in the bush and all that sort of stuff, as well as all the innuendo from the sympathisers about his best mate turning on him, Joe obviously makes a decision that he wouldn't live long to regret. But in amongst all the doom and gloom, there is a little bit of light, isn't there?
You mean Maggie?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Joe had a girlfriend at the Vine Hotel. All we know of her is that her name was Maggie, and that wasn't even her name. That was a name that she used. So she worked as a domestic servant for the Vandenbergs. Now their pub, the Vine, it was along Sydney Road. So if you know Beechworth, kind of like the high school is behind where it is now. So kind of like the last kind of house near the high school. And so Joe would go. He was risking his life every Saturday night to be with her. So he would crouch over to ride like Paddy, and then the Beechworth locals believed that the man who was going to see this woman was actually Paddy. And that was kind of what people thought to be the truth until Maggie, obviously something was happening, and she was saying Joe's name a little bit too loudly, and a boy heard, and so the Beechworth was just shocked. Word just spread like wildfire that Joe Byrne is going to the Vine Hotel every weekend to spend time with his girlfriend, and the police, I think they were just so kind of embarrassed that they tried really hard to deny it, almost like, oh, Joe, he could never be that brave, he could never be that bold, to do something like that, but he was.
Well, when one needs, one must. I think with Joe, there were certain urges that he had that, you can't get from campfires and horses. So, I think it's very naive to suggest that what Joe was getting up to when he was visiting Maggie wasn't, shall we say, amorous.
Yeah.
Though, the sanitised versions of the history tend not to dwell too much on that. But, Joe had an eye for the ladies. The ladies had a nickname for him. They had nicknames, multiple nicknames for him.
Yeah, so when Joe would go to McDonald's Tavern, England Rowan, he was so sweet to the barmaids that in return they used to call him Sugar. And so, he had nicknames like Sweet Birdie as well, because obviously, he was so sweet and a sweet talker. And yeah, the women, they loved him.
So, I think because of that reputation, that's why you see in the 2003 film, Joe is portrayed as this sort of Lothario who just picks up women like he picks up coins from the ground, And some people have really bought into that, and it really builds up this romantic idea of who Joe was.
Yeah.
But obviously he had his dark side, and what happens really is there's that kind of overlap between the light romantic side and that dark side when he finds out what Aaron's been getting up to at the Vine.
Yeah, so obviously Maggie working there, she's, you've got drunk men, and when you're drunk, you're not really, you don't really care. You don't have that control about what you're saying. So Aaron's very drunk on purpose. So Constable Alexander, that's right. No,
Well, we think it's Alexander. This is a funny thing. I'll stop you there for a moment because I've had to delve into this. We believe it's Bob Alexander because in The Last Outlaw, that's who Ian Jones pushes it as.
Oh, that's right. It's unnamed.
He's not named. The only evidence that we have this is Constable Dwyer's reminiscences, and he never names the policeman who went in. But we can assume that it was one of the police that was stationed at Aaron's hut.
Yeah, so this policeman had taken Aaron on a pub crawl, obviously hoping that, the more Aaron downs, the more talkative he'll become. So they get to the Vine Hotel. Aaron spots Maggie, and then, he tells this policeman, that girl sees Joe Byrne every Saturday night. And, and then when Aaron's gone, the policeman goes up and he questions Maggie. And she knows exactly who has, told him, gave him that information. So obviously when they meet in a couple of days, Joe and Maggie, she tells Joe what's happened.
And very, very quickly after that is when we have the Glen Rowan plot take place. And so, I mean, most of you out there will know to some degree what happened at Glen Rowan and what led up to it. You'll know about the armour, and we do know that Joe had an objection to the armour.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of talk about Joe designing the armour, but why would you design something that you hate? Doesn't make sense, Joe himself said, that, he told Ned, this bloody armour will bring us to grief. Like, I don't understand why people are so quick to kind of disregard what he said, in favour of building up this thing that, Joe designed it because, when he went to the Burke Museum in Beechworth, he would see the samurai armour. It's a really...
It's a tenuous
link.
It is, yeah. But what we do know definitively is that whether by his own decision or by Ned's instruction, the decision was made to execute Aaron as sort of the lead up to what was happening at Glen Rowan. So my personal theory, and you have your thoughts on this as well, of course, is that Ned's plan was not to kill Aaron Sherritt. They knew that there was a party of police stationed in Aaron Sherritt's hut. They knew that they wanted to lure the police train from Benalla to Beechworth, and Ned had a reputation for killing police. So my belief is that what was actually the plan is that Ned was going to send Joe Byrne and Dan Kelly in their armour to Aaron's hut to kill the police. And at some point, Joe made the executive decision to kill Aaron instead. And that the reason why they hung around was that they had to kill the police as well. But for whatever reason, things didn't work out that way. So I'll let you pick up the narrative here because I've just realised that has been plugged into the charger and the PowerPoint wasn't on. So I'm absent for a second.
So my, belief of the situation is much the same as Aidan's. I mean, we know Joe, he was quick to anger. I mean, you can't kind of refute that. So, having Aaron answer the door, all of that kind of rage and that, that disbelief that his mate, who he believed was betraying him. We know that Aaron wasn't. I want to make that clear. We know Aaron wasn't. But, Joe had been fed so much poison and lies by, his own mother. And then obviously with Maggie saying that, he's gone and told police that he's going there every Saturday night. And just to make a point on that, after, word got around that it was Joe who was going to the Vine and not Paddy, Joe stopped going there for weeks. And then the night when they're finally reunited, Maggie has to break the news that Aaron has, kind of confirmed things. Yeah.
I think most people would have trouble feeling that they are being treated with loyalty after that.
Mm-hmm.
The situation at Aaron's hut on the night of the 26th of June, very terrifying incident for pretty much everyone involved in different ways. It's very difficult for me to believe that this was a cold-blooded killing. Joe was a man of very high passion. He could fly into a rage and do horrific things if pushed, but so could Ned, so could Dan, so could Steve. Anyone could. The thing was that, Joe had so much to lose if he didn't have Aaron's loyalty that, what options did he have? And then, of course, you got Ned's stupid plan to derail the train. I don't think Joe fully expected that they were going to get out of it alive anyway.
No. I think Joe's pockets confirm that.
Yeah, so we know going from what was written that Joe had a prayer book in one pocket of his coat and in the other he had poison.
Yeah, he had poison and little bottles. Now, laudanum, which is an opiate, comes in small bottles. So whether that's what Joe had, which I kind of feel that he did, obviously we can't say for certain, but
yeah, it's very difficult to say with certainty about a lot of those things because, as with everything in the Kelly story, it's very well documented, but also not very well documented at the same time. You've got a lot of people saying a lot of things. Sometimes those things conflict, sometimes those things are different to other things, or they, clash in some way. So all we know for certain is that there was poison in the packets, and there were bottles in there as well. Laudanum was very easy to come by. It was cheap. It was used for a range of maladies, and it was basically a tincture made of opium powder and alcohol, more or less. And as we know, Joe had substance use in his nature. We know that he bought opium. It's been suggested that he was addicted to opium, and if you can't get a hold of the black tar that they used to smoke, well, how are you going to get that opiate high?
that's right, yeah.
So you get something else that will give you that kind of feeling. Laudanum can do that. So rather than getting you hyped up or anything like that, it's an opiate. It subdues you. It gives you a feeling of bliss, of relaxation. It's like morphine.
Yeah.
And thus it was often used as a painkiller. So it's not beyond question to say that Joe would have had laudanum on his person. It's actually quite reasonable to suggest that, but we don't know for a fact.
No.
But the prayer book is a very curious thing. My personal belief is that maybe it wasn't a prayer book. Maybe it was something else.
Yeah, so Aidan and I have both often wondered if the prayer book was actually what he used for his journal. Obviously we have outlaws like Michael Howe who had a gardening book, as well as a journal, and he wrote in both. So I believe that, that maybe the prayer book was, Joe's journal.
So after Aaron has been shot, about 9 o'clock in the evening, Joe and Dan leave the hut, and the police are still inside in the bedroom and all of that. We know that they're not going to be emerging until midday the next day. So it's about 7 in the morning or thereabouts when they actually get to Glenrowan. So we don't know what happened in the intervening time. It was quite a long time, considering how reasonably close Glenrowan and the El Dorado area were.
Yeah.
So presumably they camped at some point. But we know that initially Joe was sort of tasked with guarding people as they were lighting the fires in the inn and things like that. At various points, everyone but Ned took turns guarding in the gatehouse. And there's been some conflicting reports about whether or not they were drinking. Some people said they didn't drink at all, others said they drank heavily.
Well, I believe Anne Jones says this herself, that the first thing Joe did was demand her bottle of brandy. And she said it was hers, and I believe he said he didn't care whose it was, as long as he got it. So he's had the trauma of having to shoot someone he's known his entire life, and everything that goes with that. And so, him just desperately needing a drink. And I believe, according to Ian Jones, he drank the whole bottle.
Oh, it would make sense.
Which, yeah.
We know that at various points he was dancing, he was flirting. Apparently at one point he flirted with Jane Jones. At other points he flirted with Anne Jones. She tried to take one of the rings off his fingers while he was playing with her hair. He sort of had this almost like a bipolar attitude. Some moments he's really down in the dumps, others he's really energetic. We know that he accompanied Ned when they went out to take a crack at arresting Bracken. And when Thomas Curnow was sent home, despite popular belief, Thomas Curnow wasn't sent home from the inn. He actually accompanied Ned and Joe and a small group of the prisoners to the police station, and then Ned let him go from there, because they were very close by. In fact, the reason why Ned took Dave Mortimer with them to Bracken's is because it was Thomas Curnow's suggestion to take Dave Mortimer, because they were practically neighbours. If Joe had any misgivings about it, we don't know. What we do know is that very shortly after that was when the police started heading out from Benalla, and at various points Dan and Joe were sort of guarding outside the inn. When the train finally arrived, Dan was the one that let Ned know. Joe locked the doors, he put the key on the mantle. Bracken took the key so he could let himself out, and everyone got into their armour. Chaos ensued, as we all know. Joe and Ned were the only two members of the gang to actually be injured in that initial volley of fire. Ned was shot in the left foot and the left arm. Joe was shot in the right calf, which meant that Joe was no longer able to walk by himself.
No, so there's witness reports. I know in the last Outlaw, and obviously in the 2003 Ned Kelly, where he's just like got a bit of a twisted ankle. No, so Joe, the wound, it was that bad that he could only crawl, and so it's described that he had to crawl around on all fours like a dog. So he's bleeding profusely in his in the thigh. He's got all the armour on, and he can only crawl. Like, that's bloody horrendous, you know.
And when the body was later examined, one of the policemen took off the boot and it was full of blood, which means that from his leg wound, Joe was bleeding at least as much as what Ned was from his wounds as well. So, we have this idea of Ned being this indomitable, tough man at Glenrowan, but it's clear that at the very least, Joe Byrne also had that capacity. He just wasn't in the same situation where he was fighting the police single-handed.
No.
And that only came about because Ned escaped from the hotel right after the initial firing. By his own account, Ned states that after the initial firing took place and he was injured, he left the inn and went into the bush, and he passed out. The infinite evidence of him coming back to the inn at any point is dubious. He describes being semi-conscious in the bush, and a group of police riding past him on horseback so close that he could reach out to touch them if he wanted. And in fact, that party was Sergeant Steele's party from Wangaratta, And they described riding through the bush and hearing metal clanking,
Yeah.
which was obviously Ned in his armour, but they thought it was the sound of stirrup irons. So if that's the case, and Ned was unconscious in the bush um, at that time, that means that Ned had his ability to go back to the inn cut off, because the way that he got out was blocked off by Sergeant Steele's party. So that tallies up with the witness accounts, which state that after the gang went outside in that initial round of fire, Ned was never seen in the inn again. It was only the other three. So while Ned's out unconscious in the bush, Joe, Dan, and Steve are in the inn. They're trying to get the prisoners out. They're trying to fend off the police. And Joe was described as being perfectly reckless of his life. He was swearing at the police and all sorts of things. You know, he just had obviously lost the plot, and he was being very, very reckless and drinking. And it was while drinking a glass of whiskey that he was shot. They said he was toasting proudly the Kelly gang, but
how do you go from being totally reckless of your life and knowing that there's no way out to then thinking that, oh, you're going to run out the door?
I've always had the belief that, at least to some degree, it must have been very ironic. This way that he presented the toast was like, you know, the words that are recorded that he used were, "Here's to many more days in the bush, boys." And I believe very strongly that it was said ironically. Yeah. He didn't actually believe they were getting out of there. I don't think any of them did. This idea that he saw Ned appear at the back door and he cheered triumphantly, "Here's the bold Kelly gang," and then he was shot. I just don't believe it in the slightest. It's almost entirely the creation of posthumous authors who want to create this very exciting depiction. You know, Joe would not have felt elated if Ned returned.
No, he probably.
I think he probably would have wanted to throttle him.
I mean, we know that when they're in the breezeway, you know, talking, Joe, you know, like Ned, just everything over the head, you know.
Well, I mean, that whole conversation, which was overheard, you know, Joe's saying, you know, "I can't walk, my leg's broken, you know, we're basically stuffed." And Ned's like, no, I shot Superintendent here, we'll be fine, I'll kill all the rest of them, just reload my rifle.
Because the way that Ned saw it, Joe had the use of his arm, so why is he moaning?
Well, that's it. So, you know, there's this kind of antagonism at that point between Ned and Joe, because Ned seems to completely abandon any sense of the reality of the situation they're in. He seems to think that he can single-handedly wipe out the police, which is how they got into that situation in the first place, because they should have left when the train didn't arrive on Sunday morning.
Yeah.
You know, for an entire day, members of his gang were telling him to leave, and he refused. And it was his refusal to leave that got them all killed. So what we do know is that Joe was shot in the groin. Most have said that it must have been through a gap in the armour, but I don't believe that to be true. My belief is that the apron on Joe's armour was detachable, so that he could get on and off a horse with ease. And for whatever reason, he wasn't wearing it, which left his lower body exposed. Perfect situation to be hit in the groin. And he was dead within a minute or two, because he was shot in the femoral artery. And for those who are not familiar with that kind of a wound, an injury to the femoral artery is almost always fatal. Unless you get to it really, really quickly and you can stop the bleeding straight away by, you know, cutting off the blood supply. 2 minutes tops. That's how long it takes.
You know, there's, you know, reports of just blood gushing, the sound of it, you know.
And Dave Mortimer, he described seeing the blood spurting. So when Ned was captured, Dan and Steve had died at some point after the prisoners had been let out. The inn was set on fire. Joe's body was the only one of the gang members to be rescued, even though it was partially burned. And then we get those very well-known images of Joe on the door of the Benalla lockup, which coincided with Standish's attempts to get Ned out of Benalla without being seen. So in a way, that whole photo shoot was kind of a diversion tactic, where Standish was trying to get everyone not to go to the train station because they wanted to see the dead bushranger. The inquest was done in secret. The body was buried before it could be claimed.
Yeah, so it was buried at night. Just taken, I believe. There was just a policeman and an undertaker there. So the grave was dug and his body was thrown in there, buried, without anything, just left. They went home. Just on when Joe's body was strung up at Benalla, so obviously you've got the press there, you've got half of the population of Victoria standing around there. And at that moment, there's a young woman that rushes through the crowd, with the cry, "End the circus." And she, she's in tears and she wildly, throws her arms around Joe. And it was surmised by Max Brown, which is something I would like to believe too, is that woman was Maggie. Obviously being so close with Joe, you would assume that, had all things gone well at Glenrowan, they would have kind of planned a future together. So, hearing the news that the love of her life is hanging on a door, she would have been there to see if it was true.
And it probably wouldn't have helped that she was probably also at the Vine at the same time that Aaron Sherritt's inquest was being done. So she's seen Aaron dead, now she's seeing Joe dead. It would make sense that you'd be upset. So, from there's not much else that happens. At some point thereafter, the Sherritts and the Byrnes are sort of at each other all the time. They pin some thefts on the Byrnes. The Sherritts pin thefts on the Byrnes that are proven not to be true. Sort of everything sort of flows apart, and Joe's forgotten a little bit for a while, but now he's well remembered, and some of the work that you've done has really enlightened us as to the early parts of his life that have been overlooked because everyone focuses on Joe the Outlaw.
Yeah, I mean, even, as when you say Joe the Outlaw, it's not the real Joe. It's kind of the Joe that's been written about under the shadow of Ned. It's not, the real Joe.
And I know, everyone sort of thinks about Joe in terms of his relationship to Ned. But in a lot of ways, Joe was his own man was more than deserving of being considered in that kind of context.
Yeah, I mean, all of the letters he wrote when he was testing, Jack's loyalty, that was Joe. He was doing all of that. I mean, he planned because he hated Ned's plan for Glenrowan so much, and obviously they'd argue about it, And so Joe wanted to go with Dan and Aaron and Jack Sherritt and rob one of the Beechworth banks. Get money, no need to derail the train and all that risk.
So, that pretty much brings us to the end of the story. How are we going for time?
8:40.
Alright, so we've got a bit of time to go through some comments and see if we can get some questions answered. Now, I can't bring them up on there because we tried that before and it glitches out all the time. So, Georgina's going to use the magic of technology to get the comments herself, hopefully.
I can't see. There were two others, but I can't see them here, so you're going to have to unfortunately scroll.
I'm going to have to try and scroll. Alright. Alright. Excuse the thumb. Alright. Chris Orchard says, Patrick Mullane moved to Bolen and has an enormous family still in the district. I said Bolen. It's Ballin, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
Did any of Joe's siblings ever marry and have families? Pretty sure Patty and Ellie didn't, but does Joe have any direct relatives?
So we know that Mary and Margaret both got married. They got married and had children. Unfortunately, they both also died young. I'm not going to say how old they were because it's just going off the top of my head, and that's not good enough. But I know that they both had families. Kate, we know for a fact didn't. Patty, we didn't, as you say. And Dennis, I'm not sure about. He may have. I've not been able to find anything yet of what happened to him after the late 1880s, pretty much.
So there are still some descendants out there somewhere, but sort of not necessarily as direct.
No, so obviously Joe didn't have any children.
Yeah.
I know there was once I read something where a woman was trying to say that she knew someone who was Joe Byrne's great-great-granddaughter or whatever, and that's just rubbish.
All right. Let's see what else we've got. See, this is where it's going to go funny again. Vern Swampman Wiley says Fitzpatrick would had way too drunk to notice whether or not it was Bill Skillion. Maybe. I don't think so. I'll sit down. So, my belief is that Fitzpatrick was not drunk when he went to the Kelly house. Was he sort of... Oh, well, I don't think he was in the wrong, per se. He was following orders. He knew what he had to do as a policeman, but he kind of overestimated his capacity, and he overstayed his welcome. So he hung around for several hours waiting for Dan Kelly to come home, because he knew that the key to him getting cred or kudos would be to nail one of the Kellys. But in reality, I think he sort of was incapable of making that choice adequately, because he was very young. He was 22, so he wasn't much older than Dan. No. We do know that in later life he had a problem with drinking, and that landed him in jail. We do know that after the incident at the Kellys, he did drink some brandy and lemonade. But I don't think he was as drunk as he's sort of portrayed as being. I think the biggest flaw with Fitzpatrick in that incident was just his overconfidence and the fact that he neglected his duty to go and relieve at the police station simply because he wanted to make an arrest. And the thing that really gets me about that is if Dan had been allowed to go with Fitzpatrick after he'd had his dinner, go to the lockup, as he'd said that he wanted to do, he would have been cleared, because as it turned out, the charge of horse stealing against him wasn't true. It was a case of mistaken identity. So all of this could have been avoided if a certain someone hadn't burst in knowing half the story and making decisions about who and what to do. So I wouldn't say that Fitzpatrick was too drunk to know the difference between Bill Skillion and Joe Byrne. But I would say that when you're on duty, you shouldn't be drinking brandy and lemonade. I wouldn't know anything about that. We've got a comment here. Nolene says, you two were amazing to watch.
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, so obviously, as we stated before, if anyone has questions after this initial broadcast, which you'll be able to watch on Facebook, and we will upload it to YouTube as we've done with the previous broadcasts. If you put it in the comments, we'll do our best to answer it in the comments as well. Was there anything that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to?
Well, the issue that I have with Joe is that I have so much in my brain, and when it's like this, and I'm a nervous person, and it's like, what do I say? But I mean, not really. All I will say is, if you have an interest in Joe Byrne and you want to learn about his story away from Ned, kind of as his own man, I have my Facebook page, Joe Byrne, The Untold Story, as well as an Outlaw's Journal on WordPress. Currently, so I wrote a booklet last year called Joe and Maggie, which obviously centered around the relationship of Joe and Maggie and the final months of Joe's life. The current book that I'm writing is titled Arnhem, so that deals with Joe's life in 1873. So when he's a witness of the brawl between a witness of the brawl between Arnhem and Robert Woods. So that deals with Beechworth in 1872, Sebastopol, with the meeting of Joe and Ellen, and the important part that she plays as well. And yeah, so I'm hoping that I'll have that out at the end of this year. So you'll find, I'll be able to, when it is out, I'll be posting about it on my page, and obviously Aidan will be as well, for those that are interested.
Very good.
Yeah.
I've read the early versions of Arnhem, and I can attest that it is a very, very good read, even in this primordial state. So I'm very excited to see how it eventuates. Vern, was Joe and Aaron in the Greeter Gang? No, they weren't. That's a common misconception. What we do know is that the Greeter mob mostly comprised of the Kellys, the Lloyds, and Steve Hart, some of their other cousins and associations. But because they were centered around Greeter, they were centered around Greeter and Wangaratta, more specifically. It wasn't really in the area where Joe and Aaron tended to go and hang around. They were always up in Beechworth because that was their local. We do know that the Greeter mob were larrikins, and that's kind of, no different to kids these days being referred to as hoodies. I'm assuming that they still use that description.
I've never heard that.
I don't know. Maybe I'm showing my age. Because, when I was a teen, hoodies were young guys who wore baggy trousers and hoodies. And they used to hang around in gangs and ride skateboards and be a nuisance. I'm assuming that that's still a thing. But yeah, as I say, maybe I'm showing my age. But, the chin strap under the nose, the high-heeled boots, the flared trousers, all of that was just the style of teens at the time. It's no different to wearing your baseball cap backwards and singing rap songs. But, Joe and Aaron, they didn't really engage in that as much.
No, and I mean, depending on the time, they were probably up at, Aaron's selection, as I was saying, they were putting in days and days, because if Aaron didn't keep up, the selection, it would be gone. It would be taken from him. So, they weren't, Joe was spending a lot of his time in Beechworth, spending time with James Ingram, in his shop in Camp Street. And they also had another friend who was from Beechworth. His name was James Tatham. So his father, I believe his father was a bricklayer. And so there's a story that he shared in one of the papers that, one time, Aaron helped his father with the bricks. But apparently, I think after a day, Aaron was like, no, I'm not coming back to this.
Yeah, if anyone was work shy, it was probably Aaron.
Yeah.
But that said, Aaron obviously worked hardish. Like, he wasn't a slacker.
No, I mean, he worked hard if there was something at the end. So we know that, obviously Paddy Allen, a storekeeper in Beechworth, Aaron was, quite friendly with him. And I believe Paddy Allen, someone needed cows brought in. And so Paddy Allen was saying to Aaron, if you do this, there'll be these good boots waiting for you that Aaron had his eye on. So Aaron did that, and I believe, Paddy Allen remarked that it was, the quickest he'd ever seen a man work.
But, sometimes you just have to incentivise people. I've always found Aaron to be a fascinating figure, simply because there is that dichotomy between what people perceive him to be and what he actually was. Everything that I've read about Aaron says that this is a person who is definitely not deserving of that Judas label that he's always been given, and that, if anything, he's a victim of slander from even his own brother. As I said earlier, Jack Sherritt liked to throw Aaron under the bus where possible to sort of build his own profile up. And then you had James Wallace as well. James Wallace was a mate of Aaron and Joe's from when they were very little, because they went to school together for a little while. And James Wallace became the school teacher in El Dorado, but he was a bit of an odd character. He tried to get information out of Aaron Sherritt using mesmerism, which is basically, waving your hands around and trying to hypnotise him into giving answers. He gave up on it pretty quickly because Aaron didn't respond well to mesmeric influence.
So after that, he decided that maybe if I told Aaron I was writing a book on him, and that didn't work as well. So then what he started doing after that is, he'd go to the Sherritt hut at like 2 a.m. in the morning. And then, so at one time, he's gone there at 2 a.m. Aaron's sleeping right near the hearth, because obviously that's warm. He's got a blanket over him, he's asleep. So James Wallace thinks he's got the absolute most juicy goss. So he goes to Margaret Burns and he says, that he's found Aaron sleeping in the ash corner.
And then what did they get him?
Nowhere.
And that was the thing with these people, is they were spreading all these rumours about what Aaron was doing, and he was turning friend against friend. Why? Because he hoped that he might get payment out of it. I mean, when you compare Aaron Sherritt's expenses to James Wallace's expenses, now here's a man who was taken to task during the Royal Commission because he wanted hundreds of pounds worth of remuneration for horse feed. He said, well, I've got a ride here, I've got a ride there. Information doesn't give itself, so I need to take my horse, and I need money to give people drinks so that I can loosen them up to give them information. Needless to say, the police force did not remunerate him.
No.
And in fact, they kind of pushed him out of the district, made it impossible for him to get a job there. He was an odd duck, as they say. What's the time, Mr. Wolf?
Nearly time to finish.
Okay, so I've got a few minutes left, so there's still some of you watching. Hello out there in internet land. If anyone has any questions at all, or comments, feel free to shoot them through. We've got about 5 minutes more, and then we'll do our wrap up.
Yeah.
So while I'm sitting here thinking, here we go. Steve Hart was a jockey. What was his background? Now, I know a bit about Steve Hart because I did some research on him ages and ages ago. My opinion was that Ned's always the one everyone talks about. No one talks about anyone other than Ned and Joe, really. So what do we know about Dan and Steve, the ones who are sort of always in the background? So I did a bit of reading up. Now, Steve Hart's family were from Ireland. His father, Richard, and his mother, Bridget, came out as settlers. His mother was a famine orphan. She knew Margaret White, who was Joe Byrne's mother. Well, we assume that they knew each other because they were on the same ship coming over, and they sort of were in the same quarters for a while.
Yeah.
So it's reasonable to suggest that they knew each other. But there's no evidence to suggest that they fraternised once they were settled in Victoria. But Steve himself, his background, well, I assume that he had a reasonable education, but he was a jockey. My understanding is that he was a contestant in the Benalla Handicaps. Um, and he wasn't as much of a rough nut as the Kellys, and he wasn't a proper country boy like Joe Byrne and Aaron Sherritt. He was kind of a little bit more pampered because the Hearts had a bit more money. They actually had 2 selections. But yeah, Steve was a jockey because he was very slightly built. He was only 5'6", 5'7", and he was extremely good with horses. But he was a teenager, so when you got a teenager doing teenager things, they get themselves into trouble. There is an anecdote that at one point Sergeant Steele, who had a down on Steve Hart, had come to the house to sort of sniff around and try and get some information on him. And while Sergeant Steele was off gallivanting around, Steve Hart tied his horse's tail to a fence post, as you do. But we know that he spent about 12 months with a 13-month sentence in prison in Beechworth on multiple counts of illegally using a horse. He hadn't stolen them. He hadn't sold any stolen horses or anything like that. What had happened was, from what I can gather, there was a bloke who used to own the horses that he would race on, and they had a falling out. And so all the times that Steve borrowed his horses, but they were just listed as illegally using. So he didn't really have much of a defence for that, because it was one person's word against the others. And so he ended up in prison for about a year. And when he got out, he was supposed to be working with his father. They were pulling tree stumps out of the ground, and as legend has it, he threw down his axe and he said, "It's a short life and a merry one," and he bolted off to go and work with Dan and Ned in the Wombat Ranges. Whether there's any truth to that, I don't know. It seems a short life and a merry one was a common phrase at the time. But the only gang member that we can prove actually used that phrase was Joe Byrne.
Yeah, so in his letter to Aaron in 1879, he said, when he's asking Aaron to join them, a short life and a jolly one.
So there you go. But yeah, Steve's background, he was a jockey and he was a labourer. So I mean, he obviously has a very different background to the Kellys and the Byrnes and what have you. Which, he's a very interesting character in his own right. It's just that nobody really cares much about him because he's not Ned. And that bothers me greatly. So I wrote an article that was sort of a concise biography of Steve Hart. I did one that was a concise biography of Dan Kelly based on any kind of anecdotes and things I could find, and sort of a summary of everything that we knew about the family. Dan's really interesting because he was like the only one of the Kelly boys who didn't constantly get into trouble. He only went to jail once. It was for 3 months for breaking a door down because he and his cousins got drunk, broke into a store in Winton. His cousin Tom Lloyd, however, he got 6 months because there was an attempted sexual assault involved in the charge as well. From what I can gather, someone had pulled his pants down and pushed him on top of the woman who ran the store. Boys will be boys is what some people would say, but really nothing justifies that kind of behaviour. The only time that Dan Kelly ever went to jail, or that he ever had a charge proved against him, was this breaking and entering thing. And I think the only other time he'd been in court was on a saddle stealing charge, which he got off on because he produced a receipt.
He had a receipt,
But still people go, oh, he was just a low sneak, he was involved in horse stealing and rah. There's nothing to be proven. I think, if he was doing that sort of stuff, people would have been able to pull them up on it.
Yeah.
Because they did with Jim and they did with Ned, especially with Ned. And we know that Dan was more of the voice of reason.
That's right. Yeah.
It was Dan the whole way through saying to Ned, we need to leave Glenrowan. He was the one at 2 a.m. that told all the prisoners to go home. But who stopped them? Anne Jones said, no, don't leave. Mr. Kelly needs to do a lecture. And so Ned comes in, he does his lecture, and while he's doing his lecture, the cops show up. So, I mean, for myself personally, and you might find it as well to some degree, the most interesting members of the Kelly gang are not Ned Kelly.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's the people around Ned that actually make him a much more interesting character, rather than the other way around. So, you know, everyone and their dog is sort of a Ned Kelly expert these days. Self-proclaimed most of the time. Because there's just so much information out there about Ned Kelly. Everyone can go anywhere on the internet and find 50 different pieces of writing about Ned, but how many pieces of writing can you find on Steve Hart or Dan Kelly or Joe Byrne? You know, there's just sort of this complete imbalance. But Ned would have been nothing without his gang.
No.
And he would have been nothing without his sympathisers, of which he had very, very many. And most of them were related to him, but we won't go into that. So, yeah. But I would encourage everyone to go and visit An Outlaw's Journal on WordPress and Joe Byrne The Untold Story on Facebook, because you're going to find a wealth of information. And on the website, you can also find some of Georgina's creative pieces, which are based on her historical research. They take what you've discovered and they try and weave it into a narrative that gives that human face to the facts.
So I haven't done a lot of writing so far this year because I've been so focused on my book. But there are, as Aidan says, you know, I'll research Joe's life and then, you know, to bring that to life, I'll, you know, write it in the guise of historical fiction, and because I feel like that really enables people a better understanding.
It lets people in a bit more. You put the human face on it and it becomes relatable.
Yeah.
Because, you know, there's more to these people than photos in a book or names on a page.
Yeah.
But that wraps it up, I think, for our little lecture series in the Victorian lockdowns. No more lockdown. For now.
Yeah.
It's only a matter of time, people.
Well, I'm a Tasmanian, so I don't have to worry
Well,
about
it depends when they let you back in. You may have to be a Victorian for a bit longer yet. Anyway, thank you to everybody who tuned in. And thank you very much to everyone who's commented, who has asked questions, and everyone who is going to comment and ask questions. I'll be continuing on with a guide to Australian bushranging until hell freezes over, probably. I believe hell is a place in England.
That's Hull.
It's
in
Hull.
Yorkshire.
Right. So, yeah, I expect a whole bunch of stuff. On the 16th of this month, there will be an article about the Narragunda raid. And then towards the end of the month, there will be an article which looks at some of the female historians who are really going to change the way that we look at bushrangers and you know, what we accept as the official narratives. Norway. I think hell is a place in Norway, actually.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to have to do some Googling after
Okay.
this. Alright, so once again, thank you very much, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe, and we'll see you all again hopefully very soon.
Yeah. Thank you for listening.